Hello and welcome to the second video in this Patreon series. In this month's video, we'll be taking a closer look at the much requested beginning segment of the painting process. This will be a bit more focused compared to last month, which was more of a general video of the process as a whole. So I hope you enjoy it, and thanks as always. To begin with, we'll be starting with this sketch stage here, and then making our way over to here, the value sketch, to the color pass, and finally the color quote-unquote draft that is ready for painting and rendering and cleaning up to the final product. And so this video will be covering this region here. Now, of course, there is a process to get to stage 1 by itself, right? You can't magically start with a sketch. But I feel like that is actually quite a substantial process, and I want to save proper explanations for that in a different video. So for this video, we will just be focusing on this very basic sketch as a starting point. Now, I've done a little bit of layering with layers. I have a few questions as to how I use layers. So personally, I use them more like checkpoints, right? And mostly only when things are very obviously needed to be painted under each other. For example, if I'm to make the scene gray without losing the lines, I would put lines on a higher layer and use the base color on a lower layer, right? Very basic stuff like that, and only really in the beginning stages. Also for very obvious stuff like this, where you can easily overlay a good amount of things in the foreground, I just use layers. So really, number one is convenient, and number two, I try not to clutter it up too much, in the sense that I don't have to go and pick through a whole stack of layers to find the correct thing I want to edit on. Right, of course, eventually there will be a stack of layers, but it's more like a timeline or history list, right? Like a history list over here in my layers. So that's personally how I use layers, but feel free to test out what you like and find your own groove. So for the sketch stage here, the really only notable thing I want to mention is how we already did a little bit of layering early on. Like we have a window here, which is the furthest thing away. Of course, there's scenery outside the window, which is even further away in the scene. Then after that, we have the shower curtains, the clothes hangers, which all these make up the background. And then next, we have the elements like the mirror and the sink, and all the props you can find in like the bathroom. And then we have our character, which is situated nicely in the middle. And then in the foreground, we have this shelf here. And then the closest thing to us will be the washing machine with like whatever is on it. So the idea is that as early as possible, we want to get as much depth as we can into the image. Because early on, it's easy to sketch, it's easy to make mistakes, it's easy to revert those mistakes. So it's actually very simple to do early on, and it also helps you be able to tell if you will actually be able to include enough depth in the image. Because let's say we change our camera angle, and then suddenly we realize, oh no, like we are, say, looking at the character from the doorway instead. And generally speaking, people have their bathrooms walkable, right? Like people can walk in their bathroom. So when you look in from the door, chances are you won't have things in the foreground like a washing machine and a shelf. So that also kind of helps us assess if our composition is what we want. Of course, in certain situations, we don't want there to be this clutter, we don't want there to be this depth, we want the scene to feel a little bit more stir around and clean. So it depends. So anyway, in this scene where we do want it to feel a bit more intimate, we make sure we do the layering. And next step is to proceed towards filling in the values that we want. Right now, I'm using a simple paint bucket tool to fill in a large portion of the image with gray. Reasoning being, we are dealing with one relatively weak light source compared to something like the sun or daylight. So most of the image is going to be sort of a dark gray, right? Relative to the light source. So rather than painting in all the shadows, leaving out the whites, we just drop in all the grays and paint the whites instead. So that saves us a bit of time. And now, as you can see, I'm basically finding all the top facing surfaces in the scene and then giving them that extra bright value treatment. Now, of course, at the same time, I also experiment with drawing elements using the values as well. Like you can see there, I attempted a little bit with the hair. It didn't work that well, so I move on. Of course, this is still an early stage. You can feel free to basically make experiments, do whatever you want, and see how it works out. And right now I realize, hey, a black sweater in this position actually feels quite suitable because how it actually blocks out most of the window and makes it such that the gray on the window is no longer like a major element, right? I don't want it to be too big because if it is too big, it'll compete with the scene. And at the same time, you can see we're basically just adding in perhaps third or fourth values from our previous 2 value setup. And as you can see, the ceiling is a little bit darker because I anticipate that not so much light will get to it, which is the reasoning why it is actually using a slightly darker local value. And same with the things here. Certain things perhaps are made of dark colored plastic, and I just give them a darker shade in value. Now I'm playing a little bit with gradient here to see how well it does for the light to fade out towards the bottom from the top. However, that isn't necessarily always what you want, because sometimes, especially you have something like bright floor tiles or reflective floor tiles, a lot of light actually gets reflected from the floor up. So not always is it the case that the areas far away from the light source are a lot darker. Now as we continue, you notice that I've actually put in another item in the foreground on the bottom right corner. You can see in the navigator, and that item actually helps us seal in the composition for a bit. Because previously there's a large empty space where really nothing much is going on in the bottom right corner, and I think this actually resolves that problem quite well. And now we're drawing in little things. Notice that despite this being a value stage, we can still make edits to the drawing itself. We don't have to, go back to the sketch stage and add in lines to do the same thing. We can just jump in and add little details just during the value stage, right? Just paint them out, especially if they just happen to be conveniently, dark color plastic or dark color metal. We could just paint it in quickly. Same thing with a singlet, right? You could just paint it in using our dark value brush and it works perfectly fine. So feel free to be more flexible during the value stage, although it's important to also determine exactly what your lighting setup is. Right now we're just trying to figure out the forms, for example putting shadows where there should be shadows, making sure that bit's slightly more accurate so we can get a better feel of how the image is actually coming along. Because if it is too inaccurate, we actually can't tell if the image works or not, because sometimes the composition may look bad, but the reality is it's just because we forgot a couple of things that are pretty important. So we want to solve most of the obvious errors, right? Like areas that obviously should be in shadow, they should get a touch of dark values and etc. Like that kind of stuff we want to take care of during this stage. We can also take time off, I guess, to play with foreground elements, see if complex shapes add to or take away from the image. Same with the shelf here. Now we're picking out, hey, what if we add different things to the shelf? They're brighter color and darker color, and basically it's an experiment. For example, I'm not an interior designer and I don't do interior illustrations of this kind very, very often. So a lot of things I also have to go in and figure out just to be sure that it kind of works, right? And now we play with the ceiling details because conveniently we have the perspective grid and that really helps out a lot. And now we use this very handy curves layer. This curves adjustment layer is absolutely excellent when you're wanting to adjust your values. Now, it is best used when the relationship between your values is correct. What do I mean by that? For example, if the bright areas are already essentially highlighted out and separated from the areas in shadow, the curves layer allows you to play with that relationship very, very finely. Like you can make it less contrast, or rather, you could decrease the contrast between the bright and dark areas, or you could increase the contrast. And you can actually choose where along the spectrum of values you want to make that change. So it's a very flexible tool, and I use it here just for some minor adjustments, right? The scene feels overall a little too bright, so I darkened it a little bit. And I can see here's a trick I like to use. Basically, draw one straight line using the shift tool, hold down shift and paint a straight line, and then duplicate it. And then use a free transform tool and distort, so I can control the 4 corners, and then basically use the grid guide to put them to position. So this is a pretty quick and dirty way of getting this kind of repeating textures correct on, or rather in perspective, right? Because of course, you know, there's a standard tricks and methods of drawing repeating patterns in perspective, and perhaps it's very wise that you should probably know that, but obviously not all the time we want to have to go through that, so this is a shortcut. As always, we're using the digital media, so I believe that while we should understand the fundamentals and how things work and why things work, we also should make use of the tools of the digital media to make sure we save time and energy as well. Right now, see, the distort tool is actually really good, and in conjunction with the perspective guide, allows me to make edits to this little trinket on a light bulb heater lamp thing at the top of the ceiling. So you can scale it up, make sure it still fits the grid. So it's actually very convenient that I have this grid set up. And it also allows me to paint with confidence, right? Like I don't have to worry about, oh, you know, is my perception slightly off? Is something not quite right? All those things can be resolved using transform tools and, of course, our perspective grid. And again, the curves layer coming in again to make sure it's not too bright. And another example of me using the transform tool is drawing 4 circles and then just distorting them into position. And I have faith that it's very accurate, because we just basically mathematically, quote unquote, put it in there with the help of the perspective guide. And during this entire process, the idea is to continuously assess how the image is turning out. Right? Is it conveying the mood that we want? Is it conveying the correct brightness of the situation? Is it too dim? Is it too bright? And of course, that is not completely readable until we have a decent setup going on, right? So perhaps we go about 70% and then we start adding color, right? Now I'm about 70% sure that this is a fairly good scene, that the setup is fairly reasonable, and it's a place where I can work from. I can start adding color. Adding color to this scene in particular is a little bit tricky, because a lot of elements in the scene actually I didn't intend for them to have color, right? Like for example, the ceiling and the shower curtains and a lot of these, like it's the porcelain sink, like all these things generally in real life, they're just colorless or plain white, or maybe just a very, very light tinge of beige. So it's actually pretty tough, so I don't have that many places to play with. So now I try adding some red color to the shower curtains to make them stand out a bit. And that's the kind of experimentation that we go through when we do the stage. It's really an experimentative process. Same thing with here. As you can see, I kept the soft light layers for color. So if I Alt and click on the eyeball icon in the layers tool, I can clear out all layers except that layer, right? That allows me to pick out colors directly using the color picker from my soft light layer. Same with the wall. And we can make adjustments. For example, we just use a magic wand select tool, uncheck select sample all layers, which means it will just sample from the soft light layer. And then we basically have a selection of all the red, right? And that's really easy. And then we can use color balance or hue saturation or any really any tool of choice, right, to change the color of the huge area of red. And that's why I also find it useful to keep soft light layer as its own, right, rather than painting directly on the sketch with a soft light brush mode, right? Use a layer so you can make the changes until you're sure that's what you want. So I think this is a good example where layers can be used to make sure you have the flexibility to make adjustments, right? That's the key. You want to make sure the tools serve your purpose. You don't want it to be a case where you have a lot of layers, but you don't really need them, and then it just slows you down, right? In this case, I really need them, and they've come in very handy, so this is the kind of practice that I use. Again, right, the soft light layer, you can just do little things, little details with it as well, right? I can do the shampoo bottles in the back, just choose a couple colors and slap them on. And at the same time, the soft light layer, after you've added the colors on, if you don't mind, right, you can actually use the same layer to adjust values as well. For example, if I want a brown mark or a green mark in the foreground, as you can see here, I can actually use the values in the color I apply in soft light layer to darken or lighten them. So that's actually also very helpful. It's a very, very flexible layer, and I think it works pretty well for what I need to do with it. Of course, it's always optional. You don't have to use it. You can try other things. Go try hard light layer, vivid light, anything that really suits how you feel gels with your style the best, right? It's up to you. These are just tools. Again, I always emphasize that these are just tools, and you have to go and play with them before you can tell, is that for me or is that not for me? But the underlying concept here is pretty simple. We want to apply color to as many things that is relevant, like things with color. We want to make sure they're colored in. We can adjust the values in the meantime. And this is what is going on in this stage. Of course, you notice there's still a couple of very gray things here, like the ceiling and the sink, and all that is not very nice to look at. So at this point in time, once most of the colors are in, I use this very, very handy tool called selective color, add it as a layer, and then use these adjustments to essentially create an ambient light. Again, this isn't a press one button and the problem gets solved for you kind of thing, because as you can see, I'm really struggling to find something that looks good right off the bat, right? Not always do you get a situation where you apply the selective color and things work out. Mainly because we have a fairly unique lighting situation in this image. We have a fairly kind of warm light in the interior with a cool outside, so the lighting solution isn't as straightforward as let's flood the entire place with super, super warm light, right? It doesn't work quite well. Neither does it work to have a very warm highlight, because if you have a very warm highlight, and that means the rest of the room should also be extremely warm, right? So that was not the mood I was looking for. So actually, I took quite a bit of time here to try and find out what exactly is the color setup that I want. As you can see, selective color also has a lot of modes, right? As you can see right now, I'm on yellows and I'm going to the reds, and this really just gives you that much more flexibility to choose which, RGB range, which hue of colors you want to be affecting right now with the one selective color layer too. You notice that the window there is gray. I simply use the layer mask that is automatically created where you create the layer and then painted the area where I didn't want the selective color to take place with the black color in the mask layer. So as you can see, that little thing in the bottom left is unaffected. And it's really a continuous process. Right now I'm having trouble really trying to get the character to pop out on screen. As you can see from the upper right corner. It's a little too blur, but right now, hey, I realized what if we did not have the red shower curtains and just have like these cheap white plastic ones. It actually turns out pretty well. It actually kind of a nice little backdrop, right? A lot of times we want to create backdrops so our characters can get silhouetted, but not always is that an option, right? Sometimes it's just unnatural to have this type of silhouetting. But in this case, I think it works pretty well because white shower curtains are actually kind of common, right? These cheap plastic shower curtains. They're actually pretty common. So actually I realized it works pretty well. And I'm keeping track of my progress in the upper right corner. And I'm pretty happy with it right now. Turning on and off the soft light layer to check. Flipping it back. And zooming out, right? I really like to zoom out to make sure the whole image is readable even as a thumbnail. Now just a little flavor colors, little splotches of colors, touching up the lighting a bit more. And right now we use the airbrush tool, right? Normally I use a very flat brush or the standard round brush, but when I'm applying soft shadows, right, like occlusion shadows, shadows that happen where things get too close together, in this situation, the soft airbrush works really well because you can escape the hard edges, and you can also apply very subtle amounts to areas that are far away from the center of occlusion. And of course, we can use the opacity the opacity of the layer to control how much exactly is going on. For example, if I feel like overall we are going a little too hard on the occlusion shadows, I can turn down opacity from 100 to say 80 or 70%, and then it looks much better. At the same time, I could use the erase tool, also set to airbrush mode, to essentially airbrush away some of the heavier areas that have gone a bit too far. Immediately, you notice that the scene looks a lot more 3D, because now I've taken into account like the corners of the walls where light doesn't really get to, and all the places where shadows are cast, like between the curtain and the wall. All that stuff needs to be accounted for. And so in that sense, I personally find indoor scenes to be a little more challenging. You have to remember to do more things, because a lot of things get in each other's way, right? Especially when you have one light source basically lighting the whole room, compared to an outdoor scene where light basically sort of goes anywhere from top down, and then it conforms to a fairly uniform, slightly grayish look. So indoors is definitely more challenging for me, but it's also pretty fun to give it a try. Again, with skin, there's also a good chance you want to try out the airbrush tool to avoid excessive brush strokes. That's not to say you can't have brush strokes, or you must have brush strokes, or this stage must be done in an airbrush, right? It's really a tool, it's really a preference once again. And just because we've settled on this base set of colors doesn't mean we can't go back or go forward to play a little bit more with it. At this stage, we just make use of the tools to make adjustments to the image, and really just find something that makes you feel comfortable, right? Like you look at it and say, okay, I'm comfortable. Like personally for me, something feels comfortable when I can put it down and know that when I come back like 10 minutes later, it won't look horrible. So that's the kind of criteria, if you will, that I use. Once again, we just basically repeat the process again and again. Check if the value or the color is exactly what we want, make little adjustments, test it out, and now, hey, the green looks really nice, so that's what we actually ended up with. And this is the kind of process that goes on for quite a bit until the image is done. So let us recap what we have accomplished in this video. So this is where we ended up at the end of this video, right? This current stage here. What is going on is that the lighting setup is done. The colors are basically in, or rather areas where there should be color have been colored. Of course, those colors are subject to change. And the thumbnail is prepared. And the purpose of this stage is not to, say, show off to people, right? Like, you can't show this off to someone, right? Because it clearly doesn't hold up, right? So much stuff that's not naturally drawn. Like, you can still see the very rough brush strokes from like the very early sketch stage. Same thing with this. Right, the purpose here is to create a strong foundation for you to paint on. And we'll show you a little bit of what I added to it in a little bit, and here we go. So this is stage number 4 here, right? This is the image here. And with advanced here, really not by doing much at all. All we did was to basically paint in little details, like say add a wood rim to the mirror, actually add stuff to the counter, add a bit of detail to the sink, clean up the shelf on the left side, because the shelf on the left side here was really super rough. Toned it up a bit. It's still rough, but really there's not that much to do in terms of major executive decisions, right? Past the initial stage we've covered in this video. And after this stage, right, to go on to stage 5, it's even easier, right? Basically repeat the same process, except now your scene is already tighter than before, so it's even easier to clean it up further. So basically it's easier and easier and easier. And now here, see, we did a little bit of a color transition, a little bit of a color tweak to separate out the outside grays from the inside warms, right? The warm color inside. And also here, you know, to here, we darken the outside to make sure the dominant light source is the interior light and make that more obvious. So so basically we just have fun here, right? Very minor decisions to be made and mostly cleaning up duties. And from here to here, same thing. It's even easier, right? Because there's barely anything left to do. Everything is locked in. You just need to make little details like these hooks, you know, clean up the things like this, the wall vent. Use the transform tool again for stuff like this light here, cracks on the mirror, little details like the hooks on the shower curtains, tissue paper, toothbrush, and all this stuff. These are the little details that you add towards the end, right? Like at the beginning here, and this is where where we ended, right? We barely have, everything is super rough, right? Everything is just super rough, but in terms of thumbnail, it actually looks very close to what goes on later. So this is hopefully the lesson of this video, right? The foundation of the painting is extremely important. The foundation of the painting is what you build the rest of it on. So hopefully I was able to shed a bit of light on this particular process. Thank you guys again for watching this video. I really appreciate all your support on Patreon, and it means a lot to me. And I've also gotten quite a few questions on fundamentals, what brushes I use, and study methods. So please check out the bonus video for answers to those questions. Thanks again, and I hope to see you guys next month.